And we can go live whenever you are ready with Sparkle. At the top of the hour, we're set.
Yes, I've pressed that and it is preparing, and it will just take a minute for it to go live.
No worries, we're all set on our end. Just let us know, give us the thumbs up in the chat or verbally.
Thank you.
Are we live?
We are live.
I'm just gonna refresh. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the workshop series that are hosted by the Student and Postdoc Special Interest Group. We're really excited and happy to share this workshop with you all by Dr. Mariam Aly. This workshop is called Navigating Academic Careers. What are our options and how can we reach our goals? Just before we get started on the workshop, I just wanted to share a couple of things that we have going on during the OHBM conference that we hope you can be a part of. So first thing is that we do have our social tomorrow, June 22nd, in the social lounge, and this will take place at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we have the remaining workshops and symposia that are going to take place. We had a couple of workshops today and our symposia today, but we will also have them again on Wednesday if you were not able to tune in. And please do think about joining our team if you are interested. We recruit new members every year. And so we will be sort of starting that recruitment process later on in the summer. And if you're interested and like what we have to offer, we would love for you to apply to join our team. Now, on to the topic and workshop of today. We are very excited to have Dr. Mariam Aly here. Mariam Aly is she obtained her PhD from the University of California in 2013. She is now an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. In her research, she focuses on the interplay between attention, perception, and memory on the brain and in behavior. She's also passionate about helping students navigate school and life beyond it, with a particular goal of destigmatizing mental illness. We are so happy to have Dr. Mariam Aly here. She gave a wonderful pre-recorded talk. We'll start off with a summary of the talk that she'll provide, and then we'll go into the questions that you have. So take it away, Dr. Aly.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me here and for inviting me, and thanks for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with all of you about anything on your mind, even if it's related to but not touched on things that I talked about in my pre-recorded talk. So as a brief summary, in my pre-recorded talk, I answered a few questions that were suggested to me by the Student and Postdoc Special Interest Group. And some of the questions I answered included things like what a tenure track job is. I provided some examples of jobs in academia that are not on the tenure track. I discussed how one might go about getting a tenure track job and kind of highlighted the kind of luck and networking and timing aspects that could be really important. I then talked about differences in the day-to-day lives of students, postdocs, and faculty, talked about what to do if your supervisor is not your ideal mentor, how to think about sharing your political beliefs and attitudes. And then I briefly wrapped up by talking about hardships that I faced on my path. And like Hajar said, I really wanted to emphasize that, many of us struggle through mental health issues along our route, whether we're students or faculty. It's something that's very common, unfortunately. And I think it's really important to be open about those experiences and work together on them. One of the main take-home points from my talk was that we have many career options that are available to us. Tenure track jobs in academia are just one option, and they're not necessarily the best one for you. So what I would recommend is that during your training, you do a lot of work to try to do research on the jobs that are available to you. You're acquiring lots of very, very important skills during your training, and those skills can take you far in many careers outside of academia. So, the more you find out about those careers, the better equipped you are to make an informed decision about whether you want to stay in academia or not. And then knowing what options are available to you, you could then spend time during your training to put yourself in a position where you'd be competitive for those jobs. So, if you decide that you really love teaching, then you could spend some time getting teaching experience so you'd be better positioned to get a job as somebody in a teaching heavy job. If you decide that you really love the data and programming parts of the job, then you could spend more effort in becoming a really strong programmer so that you can be more competitive for data science jobs. And of course, if you decide that you really do want a tenure track job as a professor, then that's really great, but at least then you would have explored the options so that you can be more confident that that's the decision that's right for you. So regardless of what your ultimate decision is, I would recommend just finding out about all the options that are available to you so that you can equip yourself with the skills that you need. So I'm happy to answer any questions related to any of the topics that I touched on in my talk, or any other questions you have about navigating academia more generally.
Thank you so much, Mariam. I really thank you for joining us today, and I really enjoyed your talk. It was full of so many great practical bits of information, as well as it was just really nice learning more about your story and your journey through your decision making in your career. So thank you very much for that. I'll remind everyone to just pop questions into the chat box if you have any questions for Dr. Aly, and I will kick things off with a question of my own. So one theme that sort of stood out to me when watching your talk was how important luck, timing, and fit are when you're looking for an academic position. And these are things that are really kind of outside of our control. So I wonder, do you have any advice for how we can identify and focus on factors that we can control? And then also, how can we kind of seize and recognize those lucky opportunities when they come up?
Sure, that's a great question. And I also wanted to talk about the fit issue a little bit, which I only briefly mentioned in my talk, and which came up in Charlene Newman's talk related to diversity issues, which is that fit can be a way for people to camouflage what they really mean and what they're looking for. So, you say someone is a good fit when you want to hire them because they're like you or because they think like you. And use bad fit as an excuse to not hire people that maybe challenge the way that you think or who you don't see as assimilating into your environment. So, fit can mean lots of different things, and it's important to think about and challenge what people mean when they say fit. Sometimes it's something like, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and if I apply for a position that is developmental psychology, that's clearly a bad fit, but it can also be used to I think in a more insidious way to talk about other issues that people don't want to call what they are. So like I said in my talk, I do think that quite a bit of it is things beyond your control, unfortunately or fortunately, because in that sense, if you don't get a tenure track job, you can know that it's not necessarily about you, that, lots of us in academia, all of us work incredibly hard, and you have enormous talent and lots of skill, and you've learned tons of things, and you're working as hard as you can. And sometimes you don't get a job, not because you're not enough, because you are, but because things just didn't happen to fall in the right way for you at that time. We just had a pandemic that affects the job market, and that has nothing to do with you. So I do think in one sense, it can be discouraging to hear that a lot of it is beyond your control. But on the other hand, I think it can just be good knowing that it's not on you. Like, working harder, longer wouldn't necessarily have led to a different outcome. And so with that in mind, I think it is good to focus on the things that you can control, like you said. One of the ones that I talked about is the importance of networking, for better or for worse. It does help to know people in the field. And ideally, it wouldn't be like that. It would be nice if we could evaluate people objectively based on what their work is, the quality of their talks, and so on. But people like to hire people that they know or people who worked with people that they know and liked. And that's a bias that I think can be seen pretty clearly. So there's data, for example, showing that some of the more the Ivy schools or Ivy adjacent like to hire people from other Ivy or Ivy adjacent schools. There's a really strong bias there. So to the extent that you could use those biases in your favor, if you feel comfortable doing that, then that's something that I would encourage. So make use of your mentors and your sponsors to try to have them introduce you to people who could help you move forward in your career. Give talks, invite yourself to give talks. It's totally okay to, ask your friend if you could drop by their lab meeting to give a presentation. With so many things being online now and on Zoom, it's no cost to them. And usually people are really happy to have others drop by in their lab meeting to give talks. So just try to build up your network and exposure. Say yes to opportunities that you think are good for your career and say no to things that will take up your time that you don't want to do and that are not going to further your career. That doesn't mean you have to say yes to every project that comes your way, but say yes to the ones that you really want to do and make sure that you get credited for doing your work. So if you find that you're spending a lot of time on something where it's not even clear that you're going to get authorship, then that means you either need to drop that thing or you have to have an honest discussion with the PI to make sure that you're credited for your work. So exposure, we all work hard, so I think that's taken for granted, think carefully about which projects you want to do and which ones you don't want to do. Sometimes people go to grad school, for example, and they're really excited to do particular things that are going to be risky and take a long time. But often you might want to start with something a little bit smaller, just so you can hit the ground running, maybe get a smaller paper first, and then do something that's a little bit more risky later. But just being conscientious about which opportunities you take and which ones are too risky for now in your career, but maybe you'd want to do them down the road.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer, Dr. Mariam Aly. We have a question from the audience, and they ask, I was under the impression that fit refers more to the fit of one's scope of research to the faculty's research. Are personal factors really also influence the recruitment process?
So of course, what I say here is my personal opinion and observations. So you should of course talk to others about that. But my sense is that sometimes people could use fit as a way to dismiss somebody that they don't want to hire for other reasons that could be biased, or use good fit to hire somebody that they're predisposed to liking for some other reason. So objectively and ideally, we would use fit to talk about whether someone's qualifications meet some pre-specified criteria that were set down for the job that everybody agrees on, and that we could evaluate them like, is this met, yes or no? But if you listen to the way people talk about fit, it's not always that clear cut. So, things that you could do to improve that is that if you're ever in a position where you're hiring somebody, or you say you're a graduate student, you can have input on undergraduate research assistants, for example. Think about how you make that decision. Sometimes you have a gut feeling that somebody might be good. Why is that? Are you swayed by who they might have worked with in the past? Are you swayed by their similarity to you? Just try to think about what you're actually using to decide if someone is a good fit or not. And ideally what you would do is you'd have a list for qualifications that you want the person to have that you set out in advance. And then when you go through your application pool, you can make a decision about whether each person meets these criteria, yes or no, and then decide to interview the people that check most of the boxes and not let subjective things get in the way. So again, this is not to say that every time somebody uses the word fit, they're using it in a way that is, hiding bias. But sometimes in my experience, I think people do use fit in that way.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it sounds like a tricky issue of fit and hard to know when your efforts might be like, I don't want to say wasted, but hard to know who to target. Um, okay, we have another question from the audience, which is, do you have any advice for balancing doing risky or more exploratory science compared to doing research that's sure to get publications which are needed to advance our careers?
Yeah, I think ideally you have a mix of both. It can be a little boring to only do the safe things, but I've also seen cases where somebody's main and only project is a risky thing, and if it doesn't work out, it's really tough on that person. And just psychologically, it can be really hard to have all your hopes on a particular project that's risky. So my advice is probably to start with something safer, just so that, starting grad school or starting a postdoc is challenging for lots of reasons. Start with something that is a little bit less risky, something that you can be more confident in, and then have side projects that are a little bit more out there, either in terms of risk or in terms of pushing your boundaries of what you're comfortable doing. And that way you can maintain excitement and have lots of things going on, but also be sure that you're going to be rewarded for your efforts. That said, I'm a big believer in publishing things no matter the outcome. So if your study design is solid, if you don't have critical confounds that cannot be fixed, then you should publish your work regardless of what the outcome is. And I think that lessens the pressure a lot, because there's no such thing as something working or not. It always works because you did the study well and you have a result, whether it's a null result or not, and the field will be informed by that. So in that sense, starting off slowly, making sure that your experimental design is solid, that no matter the outcome, that you're going to be able to say something that's useful for the field, can just reduce the pressure on you, because you'll get results, and no matter what they are, you can write them up for publication. So I think that can free people a little bit from the pressure of like, what if this doesn't work? What if I don't get a publication? Assume you will get a publication and design the study so that you have the intent and you will publish it no matter what the outcome is. Maybe it won't be in a fancy journal, but that's totally okay.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's really important to start sort of rethinking how we can approach the publication bias that already exists, in the sense that we tend to publish things that have a positive result, but we need to be okay with publishing things that have a negative result, because it's just as informative. So I think it's better for the field and better for people's careers. One question I had, and this touches on a really good point that you made in your talk, which is that it's important to focus our training on the skills that we think will help us in terms of the end goal, whatever the end goal may be. However, what advice would you give to trainees who are unsure about what their end goal is? So they are sort of teeter-tottering between staying in academia or making the jump to industry, or even sort of other non-academic and non-industry careers, such as science communication and science policy, which are a lot more popular now. So if there's a trainee who's sort of unsure, is there any advice you would give in terms of navigating the skill sets to learn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's totally okay to keep your options open, and you should, because we can change our minds at any time. And once you become a professor, that doesn't mean you're necessarily committed to that job either. We all have plenty of time to evolve and have our interests change, and keeping your options open is probably the best thing that you could do. Usually, though, there's some things that you like more than others. So there could be a common thread in what you would like out of an industry job or an academic job. So maybe what you most love about science is running experiments or writing code or doing statistical analysis. And you could do that in academia, or you could do it in industry, but that's the thing that you love the most. Or alternatively, maybe you really love teaching, and there's many different ways that you could make teaching an important part of your job, whether it's in academia, whether it's in science communication or something else. So I would encourage you to find the things that bring you the most happiness and excitement, the things that you most look forward to in your job. And whether you do those things in academia or outside of it, you can build up your repertoire in that area. So if the thing you love most is teaching, you don't have to commit to doing teaching in academia or teaching in a more like outreach focused way. But getting experience doing teaching, mentoring, maybe outreach activities, that's going to serve you no matter what path you take. And also in terms of keeping your options open, if there's a couple of things that you really like doing, try to pursue both to the extent that you can. You don't have to close doors for yourself if you're not certain about what you want in the future. It just, use the time to try to build up different parts of your skills so that once you decide later what you want to focus on, you're not starting from scratch. You already have a set of initiatives that you've been a part of that you could build off from.
So I'd love to just follow up on what you just said, because in your talk, you put up these pie charts of how much time a postdoc is spending on various activities versus a faculty member. And, with this idea of we should be paying attention to what sorts of things we really enjoy doing in the lab in our current work, what kinds of things do you think would be a good indication that someone should try to become a PI of a lab versus, if you love data analysis and you love writing, you could do that in academia or industry, but it looks like there's all of these management sort of soft skills that you need as a PI. So do you have any, advice on that? Like what do you think would be a strong indication that you would love to be a PI?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because like you notice there's so many things that we do as PIs that we never did as trainees. So you can't know if you like it or not because you've never done it, So in that way, being a PI comes with lots of surprises, some pleasant and some unpleasant. But I'd say that there's a couple of things that you really have to enjoy. One is mentoring people and working with people who are themselves doing the science. So maybe you're not in the lab collecting data, but you still enjoy thinking through questions with people, thinking through experimental designs, problems, next steps in data analysis, debugging code. So, if you're mentoring undergraduates, which I encourage everybody to do, you can get a sense of whether that's something that you like or not. If you want to do everything yourself and you really have no patience for mentoring, I don't know if it's going to be a great fit. I do think you have to like writing a decent bit because you're going to be spending a lot of time writing grants and papers and also mentoring other people in their writing. So if that's not something you enjoy doing, it's going to be a big chunk of your job that you don't look forward to. It always helps if you enjoy teaching at least a little bit. As I mentioned in my talk, there's some faculty jobs where you have to teach very little or not at all. So depending on how much you like teaching, you can prioritize one type of faculty job or another in your search. But probably joy in mentoring people, indirectly doing science in that way, managing people, keeping track of the projects of lots of people, making sure that you can think through their needs and give career advice to individual people and try to shape their careers and their futures, and spending a lot of time writing and talking to people. So, if you like to kind of sit with yourself and focus on your science and program and do data analysis, there's very little of that in my experience, at least. Spending a lot of time jumping from job to job to job, and they're all quite different. So yeah, I don't actually know if I knew that I would like being a PI. I think I was a little naive and didn't take my own advice and that I didn't explore other career options. And I wish I had done that. And there's parts of the job that I don't like. So there's a lot of administrative things. And I really hate dealing with finances. It's just it's boring and it takes up a lot of my time. So there's some parts I don't like, but on the whole, I think I like more than what I don't like. And there's always going to be parts of jobs that you like and parts that you don't like. And so you have to be mindful of whether on the whole, the balance is more towards the things that you like. If there's one thing that you really don't like, that's okay, because I don't think there's ever going to be a job where you love 100% of what you're doing all the time.
Thank you for that answer. And I think it's going to help a lot of people sort of figure out whether they want to stay in academia and how to know, what are these self benchmarks that they can impose. We have a question from the audience that asks, following up from the fit issue, do you think a blinded recruitment process is at all feasible in academia? And I think this discussion is really important now because in the summer, there was a lot of talk about sort of banning the GREs to be used in graduate school. And there was sort of this idea that just because you have objective measures, they may still be perpetuating the systemic biases that we have, even if they may be alleviating the personal biases that we have. So this question sort of ties into that. Like, do you think a blind recruitment process is feasible, but also is it helpful in academia?
Yeah, that's really tough because, you know, the one place where I have experience with blinding is with double-blinded manuscript reviews where you're not supposed to know who the authors are. And every time I've done that, I figured out who the authors are. And I've been right every time. Like one time, they accidentally forgot to take out a piece of information that revealed their identity. Another time, I had seen a preprint with their names on it. So I think it can sometimes be easy to uncover identities in that way. And for job applications, it's especially hard to completely mask the applicant's identity because we have to look at their research, you know, their CV. You'd have to like redact the titles of your papers, but then we wouldn't be able to read the papers or look at the papers. You know, it's hard to describe your research in a way where the person would not be able to figure out who you are. So in that sense, I just like in a practical sense, I have difficulty thinking about what that would look like because we have to evaluate people based on their research, and it's hard to make the research completely blinded to the person's identity. And then, of course, there's a matter of the interview. You could have video interviews done just by voice, for example, that could maybe try to partially mitigate some effects of biases. But again, people are biased by people's names and their voices and the schools they come from. So maybe I'm really pessimistic, but I don't have a lot of hope for that kind of thing working, but I wish there was a way where we could make our biases not have as much of an impact on the decision. One thing that I do think is efficient is if people in advance of looking at any application agree on the criteria for the job, and then for those criteria, go through one by one for every single applicant and say, does this person meet it, yes or no? And then for places where they say no, they have to have a reason. So then it's not as easy to discard someone's application based on some bias that a person might have. So hopefully that kind of thing would work, but you know, there's bias built into the system from the start. Who gets opportunities, who can work in labs, who can volunteer to work in labs if they're not paid, who gets access to particular mentors, who's had parents that are faculty. So it's just like at every stage, there's biases that are built up. And so implementing something just at the end stage of the application might not be enough of a fix. I think there has to be fixes much earlier on.
I feel like this is a really excellent moment to just say that we also have a symposium around issues of equity and retention in STEM. And then there's also a really excellent series of lectures from the DIC group around racial bias in neuroscience. So just a great moment to give a shout out to those resources if anybody wants to dive a little deeper into that issue. We have another question from the audience, which is, what are your experiences regarding going through your career during a PhD or postdoc or PI level while also having children, especially speaking as a woman in academia? I don't know actually if you have children, Mariam, but I'm sure even in your peer group, you probably have you've probably witnessed a lot of women and men go through that transition. So do you have any thoughts to share?
Mm-hmm. I don't have children, but I do have many friends who have had children at actually all stages, all the career stages that I mentioned, so I can speak about it. I think one thing that makes a big difference is institutional norms around that. So some schools, you know, a grad student has a kid and they're like, great, we have 10 grad students here who have kids, and people are just very, like they accept it because of course, like why wouldn't you? And there's accommodations made as needed. Whereas in other institutions, I found that the norm is really different, where like trainees don't have children, like none of them, or maybe one of them does. And so if that's something that you're thinking about, it's worthwhile kind of doing research into the culture of some institutions that you might be stepping into, and a PI that you might be working with, to see how they've handled that in the past, because some PIs are, you know, I don't know, just you read some things on Twitter. It's like a PI said, "Oh, you're having a kid, I guess your career is over, haha," you know, and there's PIs that are like, "That's great, take the time you need, of course, you know, work when you can, I understand." So if that's something that you're thinking about, it's good to think about the norms of any institutions that you might be going in. I think the challenges faced by men and women there are very different. There are some men who are primary caretakers or split responsibilities with their partner, but sometimes it's a lot more heavily skewed to the woman doing a lot of the work. Other things to consider too is that if you're in a same-sex couple, the resources available and the financial support for having children will vary across different institutions. So some institutions will not financially support same-sex couples wanting to have a child without them having to prove infertility. And so that's a problem. So, you know, there's just a lot of research, I think, that has to be done upfront to make sure that you would be going into an institution where you would be supported. And it's unfortunate that that has to be the case. It should be something that you can assume. But I unfortunately don't think it is. But I have many friends who have had children at all the career stages mentioned, and you know, they make it work. And that's not to say it's easy. It especially was not easy during pandemic times with no childcare, but people still expected to put in not the same amount of time, even more time sometimes than they did pre-pandemic. So there are definitely lots of unique challenges, but if it's something that you want to do, then you do it at the time that is right for you. And you know, academia will have to make it work for you. And if you're at a place where they're not working with you, then it might be better to find another place and prioritize your family and what you want with your life.
Thank you for providing a lot of context. I feel like that is a very popular question that comes up in a lot of the chats that people have. And we do have another audience question, but I just wanted to piggyback off of one of the comments that you made. Would you be someone who recommends sort of pre-thinking of, you know, when someone may want to have children based on the institution that they're going to be in? So let's just say someone's doing a PhD at an institution that doesn't seem to be as accepting of trainees having children. Do you think that they should then specifically choose a postdoc institution that allows them or may make it easier for them to have children, and therefore they sort of are like planning when to have children? Because I think that's one of the challenges. It's like, it's not just as academia don't accept this, but is there a perfect time? And I'm sort of getting the sense from your answer that maybe we have to balance both, you know?
Yeah, it's tough because I think talking to friends who have kids, there is no perfect time. So you have to decide when seems right for you. And if it seems right for you when you're at a place that is not the most accepting of trainees or faculty having children, you have to think about whether that's something you're okay with. And sometimes it is, because you know your job is not the most important part of your life. And sometimes it can be okay to deal with that kind of stress if it doesn't make sense for you to put it off for later. You know, with academia, sometimes you're not even sure if you and your partner are going to be in the same place in a few years. So there's so many things to consider that I think it's hard to make recommendations about when is the right time. It's such a personal decision for each person. And, you know, there's no guarantee that the next thing is going to be better. So there's a game that you could play where you're like, well, maybe now is not right, but in my postdoc, it will be better, but it might not be. You know, there's lots of reasons why it might not work out that way. So if having children is something that's really important to you, I would do it at the time that is right for you, and academia can like wait or deal with it. And yeah, just prioritize what is most important for you. And if having children is really important, then I don't think one needs to put it off in the hopes that a future lab is going to be more accepting than a current one. But you know, if that is something that's on your mind, then doing research up front is something I always highly recommend about like, do I really want to go work with this person or at that institution? So talk to former students, ones that have left the lab and might be more comfortable telling you honest negatives than people who are currently in the lab. If the person has the lab manual, read the lab manual, talk to them often, talk to people in the department that are not in that lab group, just to make sure that you're going in a situation where you might be happy.
That's great. I like your advice of just academia will have to catch up, or you know, you just have to do what's right for you. And I think that's really, really great advice. We have another question from the audience. I like this question because of how important mentorship is, both, you know, in terms of just how you spend your time as a PI, but also there's so much discussion at this conference around trying to incentivize the academic structure to value good mentorship more than it has in the past for things like promotion, tenure, hiring. So anyway, with all of that said, the question from the audience is, what would you say are some skills required for being a good mentor, and how can we hone those skills?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'll say that it's really hard to know if you're a good mentor. Like I don't know if I'm a good mentor. Like I try to do my best, but I'm definitely aware of cases where I could have done better. And I think one hallmark of a good mentor is that when you mess up, because like we'll all mess up, is that you learn from it and you don't do it again. So, you know, don't be defensive if you make a mistake, recognize that you made a mistake, and don't do it again. It is really hard to learn how to mentor because everybody is different, and what you do with one person might not work with somebody else. And things that work for you might not work with somebody. Comments that you think are, you know, okay criticism might be seen as really harsh criticism by somebody else. So my first recommendation is when you make mistakes, learn from them and take feedback from people. If they say that you did something that they didn't like, then listen to them and try not to do that in the future. Don't doubt them, that's their experience. And it doesn't matter if it worked for you. If it doesn't work for them, then you have to adjust so that you have to be a different mentor to everybody because everybody works differently and has different preferences. The other thing I'd recommend is thinking in advance about how you want to mentor people, how available are you going to be, where are you going to be available? Are you available on email or Slack? Do you have times where you're available and times when you're unavailable? What are your rules for, you know, lead times? Are you going to give feedback when you have a couple weeks notice? Do you only need a day's notice? Just setting expectations for how people should interact with you and how you'll interact with other people. Respect other people's time. If you work at 4 a.m. on a Saturday, it doesn't mean that people in your lab will. It's okay if you do and you like doing it, but respect other people's boundaries. So, so set expectations for yourself and for other people. Be receptive to feedback. Ask people how they are. Ask people if there's things that you should be doing differently. I know some people who do like a yearly check-in with their mentees to ask them, you know, what have I done well? What could have been done better? How should we change moving forward? So just leave space for people to give you feedback about things that work for them and things that don't work, and then change the things that don't work. And just to know that you will probably have to interact with different people differently, and try to remember that what you do with one person might not be good for how you interact with a different person.
Thank you. Those are all super, super valuable tips. And I'm very lucky to have a supervisor that I respect, and she's a wonderful mentor. And so everything that you're saying are things that she does. So it's, you know, I can definitely vouch for the tips that have been said. To sort of move a little bit or change direction slightly, I was really curious as to whether you could provide some tips for building one's network through virtual means. So using social media or email, this is something that you mentioned in your talk, and especially during COVID. And I think really even in the post-pandemic world, virtual connection is still going to be a really important part of our career. And so I think it would be really valuable if you could share some tips that you've learned along the way.
So here's another place where people differ vastly in what they're comfortable with. It took me time, but I was eventually comfortable using Twitter for that reason. The way that I did it is I lurked for like a year before I even got an account, where I would just like look at the accounts of people that I respected and people who posted funny or informative things. And then eventually I realized I was wasting so much time going to the accounts of different people that if I just made my own account and followed people, it would save me time. And then from there, I kind of worked slowly up from sharing papers to sharing opinions to sharing like more personal thoughts and things like that. So if you are comfortable with social media, you can start with something like Twitter. There's no pressure whatsoever to share anything except what you want to share. Some people only use it for sharing papers, and that's fine. Or retweeting other people. If you don't want to post yourself, that's totally fine. Or like asking questions, somebody posts a paper and there's something you don't understand when you ask a question. So you could use it however you feel comfortable. Sometimes people sign up for an account and they just retweet and like other people's posts, and that's completely fine. But people will at least kind of see your name there and become familiar with you just by seeing who you retweet and what you like. And if you are comfortable asking questions, that can be a way to get into conversations with people. If you don't want to get into conversations with faculty, you can get into conversations with peers. Networking with peers is also really important. So that could be a way to build up your network. Some people don't like social media, and that's totally fine. There's lots of parts of Twitter that are undesirable. There's bad advice given sometimes. There's also a risk of just, self-promotion is good, but if all you see is people self-promoting, that can kind of get you down if you're going through a stretch where you're not being as productive as the people who are tweeting about their wins. So, so Twitter isn't perfect, and some people rightly recognize that it's not great for their mental health and they stay away from it. So that's fine. But then you might try other things like, one thing I mentioned is just asking your PI to introduce you to people. So if there's a researcher that you want to talk to because your work is similar to theirs, there's nothing wrong with either cold emailing that person. The worst thing that will happen is they don't respond, or asking your PI if they know them and if they're willing to connect you. Going to conferences, going to workshops, asking questions, dropping into like lounges and things like that at events like OHBM. That can be a way to meet people in a really low-key way that there's really no pressure in those situations. If there's speakers visiting at your department who are giving talks, go to lunch with them, whether it's a virtual Zoom lunch or an in-person lunch. That could also be a way to meet people in a setting with other students. So it's, again, relatively low pressure. You can invite your PI, you can ask your PI if they can invite people to speak at your lab meeting that you want to meet. If you have friends at other institutions, you can ask sometime if like, is it okay if I drop into this particular lab meeting just once, or do you want to have a joint lab meeting? We've had some joint lab meetings with PIs at other institutes. That's been a great way to have our trainees connect. So maybe you can ask your PI if they want to set up a joint lab meeting with somebody else whose research you're always talking about. So you do have to be active because those opportunities don't necessarily fall into your lap. But I think one advantage of virtual things is that it's really low cost. You're at home. The worst thing that can happen is that somebody says, I don't have time, or they don't email back. And from my own experience, I actually really like getting emails from people that are saying, I really like your research on this. I'm doing something similar. Can I talk to you? I think that's great. And I don't think there's any cost to sending those emails.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like that's a silver lining of COVID has been things like having guests at our lab meetings or joint meetings, things like that over Zoom. That's been a nice outcome from the pandemic. I hope that sticks around. I had a question for you because one thing that I really appreciated in your talk was your honesty and openness, talking about some mental health struggles that you encountered and just unhappiness during grad school. And I was just kind of curious if you could speak a bit to what shifted those feelings in you and allowed you to find enthusiasm for your work again. And do you have any advice for trainees who might kind of be in a darker place right now? And I feel like those sorts of mental health struggles can really make people question whether academia is right for them when maybe they're just in a bad place right now, and they might be able to shift and find that drive again. So yeah, curious your thoughts on that.
I think for me, in one case, it really was the environment that was making me unhappy. It was, it's really hard moving so frequently. And it's especially hard if you stayed in one place for a while and have built up a really solid network and group of friends, and then you suddenly move and start a new job with a new lab, a new people, a new PI. So I had a tough time with that transition. Sometimes the relationship you had with the previous PI is different from the one that you have with the current PI. And it might not work for you in the same way. And that's another burden or barrier that you have to get through. So in one case, the things that changed is just a lot of it was time. So as I got to meet more people and build up a new friend group, it just became a lot better. Of course, I missed my old friends, but just integrating into that community and having more friends made things a lot better. Another thing that helped is having a discussion with my PI about why I was unhappy and what I would like to see changed so that I could be happier in that situation. Like I mentioned, if there's a mentoring relationship that doesn't work for you, sometimes the person doesn't realize that it doesn't work for you or why. And so if you just have a conversation with them, in some cases, it can be a relatively easy fix to transitioning to a relationship that works better for you. So those were two things. I also met my partner at that time, so that made things a lot better as well. So I think there's a lot to be said for social relationships. And I think in one case, I was really unhappy because of the relationships I had or didn't have with people around me. And sometimes that could change with time and luck and conversations with people. In another case, I was actually, it was kind of weird because I felt happy, but I was in really bad shape with my mental health, which maybe is it's very difficult to describe, but I actually quite liked my work. And I liked where I lived, but I had, I think I was deeply unhappy in other ways, but I was actually quite content with my research. My research was going fine. I loved my lab. I loved where I lived. It was just a lot of mental health issues that I'd had since high school that were unresolved. And in that case, it was pretty drastic. I ended up being hospitalized for a long time, a couple months, I think, and then I had to go on leave for a semester, and that's what resolved it. It was time away and forced time to confront mental health issues, which was actually interesting because one of my main motivations was that I wanted to get better so I could go back to grad school because I actually quite liked it at the time. So sometimes the things that made me better were forced upon me, which sometimes that's what you need. You need somebody to sit you down and be like, you actually need to take a break. You need to go on leave. You need to take care of your mental health. And in my case, I had to because the graduate school wouldn't let me come back unless I did. So it was forced on me, but it was very welcome. I think I needed somebody to tell me, you need to stop and take care of yourself. And sometimes it's time, sometimes we all go through spells of experiments not working, or it's harder to make connections with people, harder to make friends, maybe you and your PI aren't gelling. Some of those things can be fixed with time. The more you're in a place, the more opportunity you have to make friends, the more time you have to get out of your research slump, because sometimes it's just luck. But also actively trying to make things better. So if a relationship is not working for you, think through how you can change it to make it work for you. And sometimes a conversation can change things. And if it doesn't, then maybe if you need to, you have to let go of that relationship. And in some cases, that might be harder than others.
Thank you very much for sharing your personal experience with us. We really appreciate it. And it definitely goes to show the fact that sometimes our mental health during graduate school isn't really related to the research or the graduate school experience. So it's really important for us to like think deeply about whether it's graduate school that we are unhappy with, or sort of the accidental things that happen to come along with any sort of shift in experience. And I think it's really relevant to a lot of trainees during the pandemic because of all the stress of uncertainty during the pandemic, lower productivity, lower jobs available. I think a lot of people are contemplating quitting academia, but they're sort of wondering like, wait, is it that I don't like academia, or I just don't like the pandemic and I've been living with it for so long? So what you were saying definitely resonated with me when it comes to the importance of compartmentalizing, like why we may be unhappy with certain things. So thank you so much for sharing that. The next question does veer off a bit, so it's going to be a kind of like an awkward pivot, but we're gonna go with it. One of the really important shifts in the conversation around mentorship is the idea that there is a mentor and then there's a sponsor. And you touch upon this in your talk. I feel like a lot of people are not clear as to what the main difference between a mentor and a sponsor is. Because, in graduate school, a lot of people have a supervisor and they assume that like my supervisor is my mentor and that's it. And as we know, there's many layers to this. Some of your mentors will not be your supervisor, but what would you say is a major difference between a mentor and a sponsor? And how do you know if someone you think is a mentor is really a sponsor or vice versa?
Yeah, I'd say that what to look for in a sponsor is someone who actively advocates for you and promotes your work, and seeks out ways to make opportunities available to you. So is this somebody who is nominating you for awards? Someone who is pushing you to apply for things where they could write you a letter of recommendation? Are they introducing you to their faculty friends? Are they talking about your research? Are they promoting you on social media? Are they sharing your research? Are they talking you up to their colleagues? Are they helping you navigate barriers, barriers that you didn't even necessarily know were there? So you could have a mentor who talks to you about your research and tells you what analyses to do next and helps you with writing, but they don't go out of their way to actively promote you and write letters of rec and nominate you for awards and tell you about opportunities that you're eligible for, or nominate you to give talks at other institutions or talk you up to their friends or introduce you to colleagues. So you really do need that sponsor person, the person who actively promotes you and who's an advocate for you, even if they're not the person who actually supervises your research. And sometimes they're not. It would be great if all mentors also were active sponsors. Sometimes that's not the case. And in some ways, it could be easier to find a sponsor than try to make your mentor into a sponsor if that's not something they're doing. So I encourage finding multiple mentors, sponsors, supervisors. It's rare that one faculty member can provide everything that you need. But sometimes there might be somebody in your department who is not your research mentor, but you feel really comfortable with, who you could go to for advice, who might be able to help you find opportunities that are useful for you. And I think that's totally fine and good, and that you should be making relationships with lots of faculty anyway. I think I might have said this in my talk, but at a really practical level, you always need multiple letter writers. So, you don't want to be tied too much to an individual faculty member and if things go south with that faculty member for whatever reason, then you're going to have relationships with other people who can support you.
That's great. I see there's one question in the chat. I might just take moderator privileges though to ask you a really quick question that I am super curious about. I see this debate on Twitter a lot of between when you're looking for an academic job, should you apply for everything or should you only target very specific job postings that you think that you're a good candidate for? Do you fall in either camp, and what worked for you in your job strategy?
Mm-hmm. I think it depends on what you would do if you did not get a job that year. So say you're a postdoc and you have funding for 1 more year or 2 more years, then it's okay to be selective and only apply to your top schools, the places where you really want to go, because if you don't get those jobs, you can stay at your job for another couple of years. But if your funding is running out, then you can't really afford that strategy, because if none of those jobs come through, then what are you going to do? So I think it depends on where you are in your career and what you would do if none of those jobs came through. So usually what I see happening is that the first time people go on the job market, they go at a time where if they didn't get a job, they could still stay at their current position for a little while longer. And in that case, they are selective in their first search. If that search fails, in the sense you don't get an offer, then the next year is like a little bit more urgent. So then you broaden your search. And then if you go on the market for a third time, then you broaden your search even further. So it's okay to start selective if you have a backup option. And then if your first search is one that is more urgent because you are not able to stay at your current position for longer, then you might want to start broad. But I would only apply to places where you feel like you would say yes if you got the offer, knowing of course that sometimes a place looks good and then you go to interview and you're like, I can't live there or I can't work there. So things change. But if you know in advance that you would actually never go to that place, then maybe don't apply.
We also have a similar question within this realm from the audience, and it asks on a slightly different, I guess it's not different anymore. Do you think age plays a role in attaining a faculty position? And I think this is something that people think a lot about, because it's much more common now to do 2 postdocs. Sometimes people spend 5 years within different postdocs, and so they're much older relative to when perhaps like 10, 15 years ago, they would have been attaining a position. And I think that's where this question is coming from.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, bias can creep in lots of ways. So I'm always hesitant to say like X doesn't play a role, because it probably does. But in my experience, it hasn't been obvious if age was a factor, except sometimes in the direction that you might not have expected, which is this person seems too green, like, they're just coming out of grad school, they're not quite ready. So I've seen that come up, like this person is, I don't want to use the word young because you can be in your last year of grad school, but if you have a non-traditional academic path, maybe you're not like in your 20s or something. So, but I have seen it in the marker of career stage, people saying that maybe this person needs a bit more time before they're ready for a faculty position. In my experience, when you're reading applications, you have no idea how old the person is. I don't think we have access to that information. Like for graduate school, I get that information, but I honestly don't even remember seeing information about people's age when reading faculty applications. It certainly never came up in discussions. I think because it's so common now for people to do long postdocs or multiple postdocs, it's not really something that raises eyebrows so much anymore. Especially if the person, if they have letters from both mentors, if they have some work to show from both places, or even if they don't, but there's an understanding that sometimes there's life circumstances that make people move and have to get a second postdoc. So I'm not going to say it has no impact, because I think there's lots of ways for bias to creep in, but it has not been obvious to me that there's like a negative bias in age. Maybe there's a career stage thing, but I think it's towards sometimes feeling that people without long postdocs might not quite be ready.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we are out of time. That hour just flew by, and we really appreciate you joining us and contributing to this SIG event. For those in the audience, encourage you to take some time to watch Dr. Aly's talk if you didn't have a chance before this. It's jam-packed with all sorts of excellent information related to a career in academia. And check out the rest of our events. We will be repeating this session on Wednesday, I believe. And all of our sessions from today will be repeated. So if you missed one, you can watch a different one. We have our social tomorrow, and do consider joining our team. And just thank you so much, Dr. Aly. We really, really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights. I know that I took away a lot from this conversation, so really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And those were all really awesome questions. So thank you for your engagement and for having me here today.
Great. Well, good evening or good afternoon to all of you, and we'll see you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.